We thought that this is actually something new for the Silver School. We thought that while we're orienting you to all the elements of the school itself, that we would also introduce you to some professional level questions. What's going on in the profession right now? Actually, what's going on at the cutting edge of the profession? So we want to sort of give you sort of a window in, at least a brief window in, to some of the issues, the conversations that many across our entire profession are having about some of the shared challenges that we have. And so, you're going to learn, you already heard a little bit from several of us about direct practice, working to serve maybe one client at a time, one family at a time, or maybe one community at a time. As you, I'm sure, know already, that many of the questions, the challenges, the dilemmas, the problems that will come forward to you are not those that are just individual. They're oftentimes shared challenges. They're oftentimes interconnected with other larger problems. And how do we connect the micro to the macro, if you will? And so many of us have been discussing how do we as a profession take on some of the what we call grand challenges for our profession. And so actually I had the great privilege of, in 2012, being at a little island retreat off of the coast of Seattle, where there was a conversation about some big questions. How do we think ambitiously? How do we think about addressing and making real progress on some of the biggest problems that we as social workers are concerned about? And this notion of a grand challenge initiative was incubated or hatched at that retreat off in Bainbridge Island. And so what we learned about what is a grand challenge initiative, actually a number of other professions have engaged in a framework to help an entire field, profession, even countries. Canada has its own grand challenge initiative, for example, tackle some of the big questions in a way that we can achieve measurable, real progress in a big way. And so, for example, the profession of engineering is mapped out in 2008, such as how do we make solar energy economical? How do we secure technology to prevent nuclear terror? What are the big questions, issues that we as a profession can actually make real progress on in a big way? And at that meeting off of in Bainbridge Island, the current then president of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare was there and said, you know what, this is a great initiative for the National Academy to take on. And so what they did is they essentially, with the members of the American Academy, which are essentially leaders of our profession, how do we curate a list of the biggest concerns, the biggest challenges for us as a social work profession? And so they curated a list of 12 grand challenges for the coming decade. What can we actually achieve measurable, tangible progress on in the next 10, maybe 15 years or so? So these are solvable problems, but we're not yet there. They're maybe just over the horizon where we can really move the needle, as you will. And so I think can you read that okay, or not? Is that very readable to you? So some of the grand challenges that the American Academy identified are such things as stopping family violence, closing the healthcare gap, ending homelessness, and so forth. These are sort of organized a little bit from micro to macro, but they're obviously interconnected, micro, macro connected. Reducing extreme inequality, promoting smart decarceration, and so forth. These are some of the big issues of our day that we as a profession can take on. And so each of those grand challenges then began to form networks of scholars, stakeholders, policymakers, practitioners to then come together and begin to map out a forward agenda for national progress on each of these. And so one of the amazing things, there are many amazing things about NYU Silver, but one of the amazing things about NYU Silver is we have actually 3 of the national leaders on 3 separate grand challenges. And so we thought we'd just sort of introduce you to a conversation about where those are at on 3 of the grand challenges. And so I'll briefly overview each of the 3 faculty leads here. And then we'll let them each talk just for briefly, because we're really short on time, briefly about 5 minutes or so about each of the grand challenges. And then as time permits, we'll engage in a bit of a conversation. And then we'll also present a way for you all, if you wish, to engage in the National Grand Challenge Initiative. We have a student-initiated and student-led competition, and we'll have some of your colleague students present that and pitch a way for you to get involved in this. So first of all, let me very briefly introduce Professor Ernest Gonzalez. Actually, Ernest, I think this is your first broad appearance, because Ernest just joined us over the summer from Boston University. And so welcome, Ernest. We're delighted you're here with us. And Ernest's work is really focused on the issue of productive aging, related to employment, volunteering, and caregiving, as well as questions of health equity, intergenerational relationships, and related social policy questions. Professor Gonzalez is, in fact, the national co-lead on the Advancing Long and Productive Lives Grand Challenge. So we'll hear from him in just a few moments. Second is Professor Deborah Paget, who is, let me shout out Deborah. And Deborah has been here a little longer than Ernest. She's our wise veteran, one of the nation's leading scholars on the question of homelessness, where she and some of her colleagues are ushering forth a changing paradigm approach to addressing the problem of homelessness in the United States. And in fact, she has recently published a landmark volume on this question entitled Housing First, Ending Homelessness, Changing Systems and Transforming Lives, which was published in 2016 by Oxford University Press. And she is the national co-lead on the Grand Challenge to End Homelessness. So we'll hear very briefly from Professor Paget. And then third, we have Professor Michelle Munson. Michelle is also our incoming Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and is an expert on mental health service use among emerging adults, those who are in adolescence and transitioning to adulthood, and has particular expertise in the interconnection between social structure and social relationships and young adults' decisions to seek professional mental health support. And Professor Munson is one of the leading intervention researchers on the National Grand Challenge Network focused on reducing social isolation. So what we'll do then is let each of them briefly overview their grand challenge, and then I'll come over here and pitch a few questions. And we actually have 1 or 2 questions that came in from students, and so we'll have, as time permits, a bit of a conversation. So Michelle, I think you're up first.
So I just also want to start by welcoming all of you to Silver, to NYU, and for some of you to New York City, and to the social work profession, and thank you, Neil, for that wonderful introduction. The Grand Challenge to Eradicate Social Isolation addresses the correlation between social isolation and poor health outcomes, such as increased rates of morbidity and mortality. It also works to build social relationships in different ways and reduce loneliness among people across the lifespan. Isolation as a concept, right, occurs when individuals do not have others physically around them. And loneliness, on the other hand, is about feelings. It's an emotional state of dissatisfaction in relationship. An example of how these concepts that we work on in this Grand Challenge are related but somewhat distinct is that an individual can feel lonely, extremely lonely, even in a room full of people, perhaps like some of you feel today. The Grand Challenge to Eradicate Social Isolation came into clear focus as studies were published reporting things like the magnitude of risk associated with social isolation is comparable to smoking and other major biomedical risks. You can see that social isolation has been associated with a whole number of varied outcomes, A couple of examples are having a lack of normative pressures from social others to engage in healthy behaviors, like going to doctor's appointments, for example. And then more traditional outcomes, such as depression and anxiety. Many different organizations have declared, some repeatedly, that social isolation and loneliness are critical major factors for us to be dealing with today. We know somewhat intuitively, right, that people do better in community, being part of communities. However, we also know that so many people struggle to become integrated into community and to develop communities for themselves, often because of large macro-level structural factors that many of us care about, like racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, among many, many others. And as one of my colleagues who presented on this grand challenge in a previous conference stated, that's Dr. Sandra Crew from Howard University, social isolation is a micro-level consequence to macro-level social forces. So we have to be thinking about it in those ways. So many colleagues that are involved in this grand challenge are working in different ways. So just briefly, some of my colleagues are really working on issues of social measurement. So how do we realize whether we are actually making change? So thinking about measuring loneliness and measuring social isolation, like our network lead, Dr. Jim Lubin at Boston College's Institute on Aging. And if you're interested in aging in social isolation, I would encourage you to look up their work. Other colleagues, such as myself and others, are really involved more in developing programs that provide social support. And you see some of them up here, including programs we're working on at NYU Silver and in many other places throughout the country. And we're finding that some programs, particularly those up here, that involve mentorship, providing marginalized young people with mentors, have in fact reduced things like depression, social isolation, loneliness, among many other outcomes. And then a third area in our grand challenge that's interesting is led by our other network co-lead, Betsy Tracy. And her expertise is really about examining social networks, social network analysis, and in her case, for women in recovery from addictions. And so that work really kind of tries to understand how networks are working or not working to help people get to their appointments and engage in their health care. A recent study that my new colleague, Ernest, brought to my attention using Medicaid spending data just to show the impact of this network work showed results that suggested, quote, a lack of contacts in older adults' networks was associated with $6.7 billion of additional federal spending on services such as skilled nursing for folks who didn't have natural supports in their networks. And we're facing a new set of intriguing questions that some of us are discussing involved in this grand challenge around the role of technology, which we've heard about already today, things like Twitter, and its role in social isolation and loneliness. Increased colleagues of ours are studying interventions like mobile health and online support groups. And technology and social isolation, when I think about it, I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a lot of concern about folks spending hours and hours on handheld devices and computers at the cost of social connection and social relationship. But on the other side of that, we know that technology can provide increased access to community and connection and perhaps reduce loneliness. So I think there's a lot of new work that needs to be done in that area. And just in conclusion, it is indeed a time, I hope that this has sparked some ideas for some of you and you've become excited. That's exciting, but also of great concern. I imagine some of you are reading things coming out about loneliness in our popular presses. So I hope that while you're here at Silver, You'll get involved in different ways because we are called by our mission as social workers to bring those who are pushed to the margins, who are lonely, and who are isolated back into the fold. And how do we do that? We do that through our work, through our practice and our research. So again, welcome and thank you for listening to this grand challenge.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, it's okay? Okay, good. So, welcome to all of you. I want to start with a question, and I want to ask you to hold up your hand if you can remember a time when there were no homeless people sleeping on sidewalks. Faculty, you don't have to do this. No offense, but see? Okay, how many of you were born before 1975? Okay. This tells you something, does it not? It's a sad reminder that on any given day, about 500,000 people are homeless in this country, and in any given year, 1.6 million people are homeless. Now, it's not all bad news. In the past 7 years, we've had significant decreases in homelessness, particularly among veterans and among chronically homeless, but we still have what is called an epidemic 4 decades later. So this brings me to the grand challenge of, oh goodness, I'm glad I get away from that. Okay, thank you. Oh. Anyway, sorry, I didn't know that was up there, I apologize. Anyway, so back to the grand challenge business. So we thought, what better way to have a grand challenge than to talk about ending homelessness? So this is fairly ambitious, but I think tailor-made for the social work profession. Our goals were to take the best practices known and use research, policy advocacy, and social work education to address this particular daunting challenge. So the co-lead is Ben Henwood, who's a former doctoral student of mine. And I am the co-lead along with him, and this grand challenge has grown into a national collaboration with the Center for Excellence in Homeless Services located at the University of Albany. And this is just one of the examples of the partnerships that we brought to bear in addressing this in a national social work professional way. What the center has done in Albany is really focused on social work education and including more about curriculum and resources. So I urge you to go to some of these websites if you're interested and learn more. There's webinars, there's a lot of resources about ending homelessness. And also come see me, because I didn't put my email, but you can find me, because I'm very interested in this and I have worked with students, both undergrad and master's and doctoral students. So a little closer to home, I just want to mention that the Silver School is proudly the home of the annual National Symposium on Solutions to End Youth Homelessness. This is an annual conference every spring. It will be June 2019. And it has drawn over 3,000 providers, youth advocates, and researchers. And we really seek to feature the latest in ending youth homelessness, including rapid rehousing, family strengthening, and host homes. So I urge you to consider that if you have time with all your studies next June. Okay, I'm going to end with a shameless plug for the book. But I also want to say, this for me is the crux of the matter. We actually know how to end homelessness, and that's to provide people with a home. And Housing First is the approach that does this. This doesn't require people to jump through endless hoops of bureaucracy and demonstrations of worthiness, but in fact gives them a home as the stability and as the foundation for recovering their lives. Housing First started in New York City in 1992. I could spend hours, which I won't, of course, talking about what it would take to enact it, but it has been adopted in Canada and most countries in Western Europe and New Zealand as a national policy, and it's promoted by HUD here in this country to move us away from shelters towards more permanent housing. So Housing First is, for me, the way to address this grand challenge. I think the longer-term fundamental causes you're going to learn about in your classes, and I know you're familiar with these structural causes, the lack of affordable housing, the idea that housing is a right, and that the inequalities we see in our society are producing this phenomenal, sad epidemic of homelessness. So I'm going to end with something that I take away from my grad student days, which I won't tell you how many years ago that was. But this is Maslow's pyramid, and it's come back to be useful to me in really underscoring the importance of housing to achieving so much else in our clients' lives, in our own lives. For me, housing is fundamental. So thank you.
Good morning. Let's see where we're at here. Oh, good, I could switch off that slide. As many of you know, possibly know, we are living longer than we have ever in the history of mankind, of humankind. And one study suggests that half of all the children who are born in Western societies today will live to be 100 years of age. And the other half are going to be pushing the boundaries of 80s and 90 years of age. So the implications of population aging are profound. And so, our grand challenge, it really not only asks the question, how can we maximize the opportunity to live a long and productive life, but how can we live a long, productive life that is filled with family and community and opportunities, and just like Nikki had stated earlier, fun. How can we have that kind of life? And how can we not just have it for a few, but how can we have it for everyone? That's the grand challenge of productive aging. Often when we think about aging, a number of words that start with the letter D come to mind. And indeed, that is a deficit's perspective. Productive aging, which has really been led by social workers, introduces the notion of assets and strengths-based approach. And it asks us, what are the implications for our research, for our education, for our practice, for our advocacy, when we let go of a deficits perspective of population aging and we adopt an assets, strength-based approach to it? So we define productive aging as any activity that produces a good or service for society, whether paid for or not, and we could have a very, very long conversation of what activities would fall under this very big umbrella. But for the purpose of our grand challenge, we really narrowed it to employment, volunteering, and caregiving. And as we continue to develop the scholarship here, we have been steadfast to what I believe are social work core values, values of inclusion, of equity, of intergenerational cohesion, of choice, because we know so often that many individuals don't have choices for the occupations that they engage in, for the caregiving, or don't have opportunities for volunteering. So we're constantly pushing forward these core values. Under the right conditions, and I have, similar to Deborah, we could go on for hours of what does it mean, right conditions? But under the right conditions, we can yield multiple benefits across a number of levels. So there's emerging research to suggest that the type of work we do early in life and midlife could reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. That's a silver lining in population aging. Another study suggests that formal volunteering by older adults saves our country $40 billion a year. Informal caregiving saves our country anywhere between $100 and $500 billion a year. So we could do more to maximize these positive outcomes through our scholarship and our education, practice, and policy. Social work researchers and you all, our students who graduate from our programs, become the leaders that conceptualize programs, that implement those programs, evaluate and disseminate. It's with you all that we start to advocate on the Hill. It's with you that we make that impact with older adults. And so in closing, I welcome you to NYU as well as my other colleagues. This is your new academic home. I challenge you to bring it. Bring your intellectual curiosity. Bring your sensibility to diversity and inclusion. Bring your passion for the populations that you're interested. And, here are the grand challenges, and we will be with you for the next 2 years and beyond. We continue to have good relationships with our students afterwards. So welcome. That's just a little teaser of productive aging, and look forward to meeting each of you.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time to have a little back and forth conversation. I'm actually going to go right, given the limited time, I want to sort of go right to the heart of sort of the present moment. Right, so when I mentioned, and I think many of you know with me on stage, that the Grand Challenges Initiative itself was really established about 5 or 6 years ago, and each of your Grand Challenges were mapped out about 5 years ago. In the way the world works now, 5 years is a long time ago. And so I'm just thinking about the national conversations, for example, around immigration, or around gender identity, or around race. How are you thinking differently now than you did 5 or so years ago about your grand challenge? Is your network adjusting, thinking differently, acting differently, given where we're at the current moment?
I wish I could say that homelessness has gotten so much better in the last 5 years and that we could. I will say I think that the grand challenges were intended to capture as much as possible, sort of the sense of movement, forward movement. But I'd be the last person to say we shouldn't be flexible and looking ahead and addressing these issues. And I think a lot of us among the grand challenges have talked about cross-cutting issues, and immigration and racism and social justice really underlie so many of these. So I think that's our